be here. And actually, something that connects to the introduction you just heard. I was born in Havana, Cuba. My parish, 2 blocks from my house, was San Agustin, run by American Augustinians. And they had just opened Villanova University outside of Havana. And, well, it didn't last too long. But I had hopes of attending Villanova instead of the University of Havana, but I never got the chance. Now I'm in Villanova. So, writing the history of the impossible. What could that be about? When I described the subject to start a lecture with students, a student raised his hand and said, "No, Professor Eire, you're not writing the history of the impossible. You're writing the history of the ridiculous." Because I've been specializing lately on miracles that are considered truly impossible even by very pious people, especially 2 miracles, levitation and bilocation. And we'll get to some of this. But the lecture is focused on a huge difference between Protestants and Catholics. Huge difference that emerged from the very, very start. And it is whether miracles take place or not. Not outlandish miracles, just miracles, period. So is there a way I can fast forward, change the images other than stepping over to the laptop? Or, oh, okay, great, thank you. Thanks. So, yes, we all know 500 years ago, Luther started something. But the first item that I'd like to cover is the fact that Luther began something, but he was not the only one. And that in fact, we speak of the Protestant Reformation when there are Protestant Reformations, plural. And there were sharp disagreements among Protestants. So on the subject of miracles, yes, there's sharp differences between Luther, the Reformed Protestants to his south, and those troublesome people he referred to as Schwärmer, lunatics, nuts, the radicals. He changed Western civilization in many ways, and of course the most obvious change is when he begins to call the Pope the Antichrist and gets rid of the Pope, gets rid of the Catholic Church. That's a big change. And here you have an illustration from the late 1540s, the old rotund Luther challenging the Pope with his Bible. And you see the Pope is falling and he's being supported by Catholic clergy. But who do you have around Luther? You have all the other reformers. Even an Anabaptist, Menno Simons, at the bottom. An acknowledgement of the plural reformations. And also an acknowledgement of the biggest change, biggest difference between Protestants and Catholics. What unites all Protestants? They despise the Pope. And they don't believe in the Pope. But, if you could... Of course, Luther was not alone. And Catholics did not take his Reformation as a reformation, but as a revolution, a revolt. And this is a Catholic image from the 1580s, depicting all the major Protestant reformers in the attempt to destroy the Catholic Church. And there you have the greatest of all the Protestant reformers trying to pull the parts of the church down with chains, breaking the windows, breaking the images. But I think you would appreciate that the 4 corners of the church, the towers, are the 4 great fathers of the Catholic Church. Gregory, Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustinus, who remains unshaken. Next, please. And this had a long lesson to go with it. This is a Catholic broadsheet. That's the text, right? But there's the title, which I like to highlight because it shows you the difference in perspective, where we've come in the last 500 years. We now speak of Reformations, plural, and can include the Catholics in Reformation. But at the time, no. Mirror of the militant, true, steadfast, age-old Catholic Church of God, against which many tyrants, heathens, Jews, and heretics revolt, tear down, burn, and break by storm, but which church to this day remains steadfast against all storms, in which until the end of the world, by God's grace, shall endure. They liked long titles in the 16th century. And then the text telling you how utterly awful these Protestant monsters are, and how they have utterly failed. Pure confrontation, absolute pure confrontation. But we could move to the next one. What was the most profound change? This scary-looking man, Max Weber, over 100 years ago, argued that perhaps the largest, biggest, most tremendous change brought about by the Protestant Reformation was the disenchantment of the world. What he meant by that, it needs to be explained, because the German word that he used, Entzauberung, does not really translate into disenchantment, the meaning we give to that word in English, because Zauber in German means magic. So another way of translating Entzauber is that the Protestant Reformation had rid the world of magic. Now, where would he get this? Okay, his mother was a good Calvinist. And at the time of the breakup, beginning in 1517, throughout the 16th century, into the 17th century and beyond, Protestant view of Catholic ritual, and especially ritual, but also the symbols, that it was magic or superstition. Right? That's what Weber is talking about. I think we need to understand Entzauberung, or disenchantment, in another way. Because we associate magic with trickery, with cheap stagecraft, legerdemain, and so on. But magic was a serious pursuit in the 16th century. When Protestants called Catholic ritual magic, they didn't mean stage magic. They meant real magic, which includes, well, there's Dr. Faustus making his pact with the devil. And you know the rest of that story, I'm sure. Next, please. Ridding the world of magic, beginning with Luther, means ridding the world of present-day miracles. This is a quote straight from Luther, and it's worth reading. Those visible works are simply signs for the ignorant, unbelieving crowd, and for their sakes that are yet to be attracted. But as for us who know already all we do know and believe the gospel, what do we want them for? Wherefore, it is no wonder that they have now ceased, they being miracles. Like miracles have ceased, since the gospel has sounded abroad everywhere and has been preached to those who had not known of God before, whom he had to attract with outward miracles, just as we throw apples and pears to children. A developmental view of humanity and of religion. Quickest way to explain what Luther is getting at is this. The Bible is full of miracles. You wouldn't have the Bible without miracles, Old Testament and the New Testament. The way Luther interpreted biblical miracles was that they served a function. What function did they serve? They were there, they were necessary, not just because, as he says here, people were kind of childish. No. It's because whenever God revealed himself, he needed to prove that the messengers of this revelation were plugged into the truth. So Moses had to work miracles. Jesus and the apostles had to work miracles to convince people that God was actually in their midst and that something was about to change. However, this is Luther's view of the history of the miraculous and also church history. Once the gospel had taken root, Luther argued, there was no longer any need for miracles. No raising of the dead, no healing of the sick, none of this stuff, making blind people see them. I'm always reminded of the line in the Flannery O'Connor small novel, Wise Blood, where the character Hazel Motes is preaching, and he's trying to establish the church without Christ, and he preaches with the following line, I'm member and preacher to that church where the blind don't see, the lame don't walk, and what's dead stays that way. This is the church after the death of the last apostle. Once the last apostle died, probably John, no more miracles. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why would Luther exegete the entire Bible this way? And why would he interpret the history of the church that way? Post-apostolic church. Initially, from day one, once Luther is on the other side, Catholics claim, but we have miracles. You can't be right, and your church can't be the true church because you don't have miracles. Good way to respond to such charges, of course, is to say, we don't need miracles. Miracles are no longer necessary. But there's more to it than that behind Luther's position and that of the other reformers too. Down south in Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli. Here's a big difference between Luther and Zwingli. Luther doesn't have metaphysical concerns about reality, about the relationship between matter and spirit. He's not troubled by these metaphysical issues. Zwingli is. And Zwingli has drunk deeply from the writings of the humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam, who has also drunk deeply from Florentine Neoplatonism. Those who trust in any created thing whatsoever, Zwingli said, are not truly pious. Why not? Certain principles that Zwingli was convinced, right, explained reality. First one being, the finite cannot contain the infinite. Finitum non est capax infiniti. Latin always sounds better in a church. Honestly, that ring. Well, another quote straight from Zwingli. The physical detracts from the spiritual. Quantum sensui tribueris, tantum spiritui detraxeris. You take away whatever you give to the sensual or material, the physical, you take away from the spiritual. Matter, for Zwingli, was not just incapable of bridging the gap between heaven and earth, the capax. It wasn't just incapable, it actually stood in the way. It was an obstacle. Next, please. Much younger successor in the Reformed tradition, John Calvin. New generation, but still in agreement with Zwingli about these metaphysical principles. Whatever holds down and confines the senses to the earth is contrary to the covenant of God, in which, inviting us to himself, he permits us to think of nothing but what is spiritual. Luther doesn't agree with this. So, okay, we have this major difference between Protestants. the Reformed and the Lutherans. However, they both reject the possibility of miracles, post-biblical miracles. Next, please. Here we get to the good stuff. What about those miracles claimed by the Catholic Church? How can they be explained? They're demonic. Another quote from Calvin that sums it up very nicely. He's not the first one to say this. Luther said this. Zwingli said this. Calvin says this. We may also fitly remember Satan has his miracles, which, though they are deceitful tricks rather than true powers, are such a sort as to mislead the simple-minded and untutored. Notice that condescension again. Children on the one hand, simple-minded. Idolatry has been nourished by wonderful miracles. Yet, these are not sufficient to sanction the superstition either of magicians or of idolaters. They have that concern, that deep concern about mixing spiritual and material, about trickery, wrapped up in a nice demonic package. And here, let me pause for a second, and there's no image to match this. This is one of the things that interests me the most about the debate on miracles that the Reformations create. You've already been exposed to this large difference between Protestants and Catholics. The Protestant God does not break the laws of nature unless he's got a message to deliver. Other than that, the laws of nature are always the same. They don't get broken. However, Protestants accept the very same devil that Catholics have had for over a millennium. And they don't change anything, basically. Because the devil, throughout the Catholic Middle Ages, it was believed the devil tricks people. The devil is a very, very good trickster. The devil, however, does not have supernatural powers. The devil has preternatural powers. Why? Because he is so much older than humans. He's seen everything. And he's also smarter than humans. And he knows how the laws of nature work. So he manipulates the laws of nature. Technically, it might look like a miracle, but theologically, it's not a miracle, it's a trick. Okay? So, next one, please. Lutherans, especially, but Protestants in general, continued to believe that God, while he may not break the laws of nature, sometimes used the laws of nature to convey messages through wonders. In Lutheran Germany, Wunder. What are wonders? Wonders are natural events, weird things, that always convey a message. And the message usually is, this community where this happened, something is happening that's not quite right, and that behavior needs to change. So things as odd as, Siamese twins, human or animal, weird things happening in the sky, such as, and this has been proven, it does happen, raining fish. A tornado picks up fish from a lake and drops them somewhere else. They had no other way of explaining this in Lutheran Germany than as a sign from God. Or as happened to me the one winter morning in Minnesota when I moved to Minnesota. I walk out of my door and I see 3 suns. And I think maybe it was the punch that my housemate had spiked the night before, maybe a little too much grain alcohol in it. But no, it was a reflection of ice crystals. You can see 3 suns, called sundogs. Those were also interpreted as messages from God. So God doesn't work miracles, but he sends messages that are quasi-miraculous. Next, please. Eventually, miracles do work their way back into the Protestant tradition. And those in this room that are old enough to remember televangelists such as Oral Roberts, forget the names of all the other ones that were on late night television, but yes, they're constantly healing people and performing miracles. I'm not saying that Protestantism as a whole rejects miracles. I'm saying in the Reformation era, they were rejected. They come back in a very odd way, especially in evangelical and Pentecostal Protestantism. Next, please. But Catholics are very different. Yes, Catholics have wonders. Yeah, Wunder, yeah, sure. Yeah, God sends messages. Catholics had that too. But there are all sorts of miracles. Extreme contrast. This, of course, is a photograph. It depicts, next slide, please. This man, St. Joseph of Cupertino. I bring him up, I'm going to bring up two examples of the way in which the following happens. Protestants say, okay, no miracles. Plus, your miracles are demonic. Decade after decade after decade, you get to the 17th century, and you've got Catholics emphasizing extreme miracles. You say we don't have miracles? You say they're demonic? Well, look at this. So I'm going to do two extreme cases that point to you how it was that Protestantism, their denial of miracles, actually shaped Catholic piety to a considerable extent. Joseph of Cupertino, Giuseppe d'Essa, the Flying Friar. Look at his dates, 1603, 1663. This man is a contemporary of Descartes. He is a contemporary of all the early great scientists. This man levitated so much and flew so much. The poor man, the Franciscans kept sending him to ever more remote places. And he ended his life a prisoner in his cell in a remote corner of northern Italy because he was so distracted. They only let him come out to have one meal a week with his brethren and to share Mass with his brethren once a week because he was always up. And one of the worst films ever made, ever, if you want to see one of the worst films ever, The Reluctant Saint, starring Maximilian Schell. It's about Joseph of Cupertino. It's a horrible film, absolutely horrible. But there he is, removed to northern Italy. He sees the Holy House of Loreto for the first time. And whoop, up he goes. And I say whoop, I'm not making fun of him. The hagiographies say that every time Joseph went up, he let out a little whoop. And he was such a good Franciscan that nature itself could bring him to ecstasy. A flower, a flock of sheep, or my favorite, one day, for the first time ever, somebody cut a pomegranate in half right in front of him, and seeing the inside of the pomegranate. Whoop. It happened while he was saying Mass. It happened when he was introduced to the Pope. He rose above the Pope's head, and the Pope supposedly said, if this man dies before I do, I will be sure he's proclaimed a saint. So it convinced even the Pope. So history of the impossible. How do you write the history of these things? We have hundreds of testimonies of people who saw Joseph off the ground or actually flying. One time he supposedly flew from one end of the nave to the other at the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, in the process converting a Lutheran prince from Saxony, who said, this must be true. Next, please. There you have it, saying Mass and rising to the air. How do you write this history? You've got eyewitnesses. What do you do with those eyewitness reports? how can you, as an objective historian, write about these things that not only seem impossible, but as the student said at that presentation of mine, ridiculous. Right? Next, please. There he is again. Actually, he has an outdoor cross falling down, and he put it back in place. Next, please. It's not just St. Joseph. Look at 17th century religious paintings, Catholic, and you will find a lot of depictions of levitation. But what is levitation? Levitation is a mystical ecstasy, and it's uncontrollable. None of these saints who are seen as levitators ever bring it on command. No, it's part of an ecstasy. St. Teresa of Avila has the longest first-person description I have yet to find of what it's like to levitate. And she says it's like a great force comes beneath you, pushes you up, and no matter how much you resist it, you can't. And she had an explanation for this. She said, in ecstasy, the soul is pulled towards heaven so quickly and so violently that the body must follow. That was her explanation. 16th century Carmelite science. She also said that during these ecstasies, this is her phrasing, the soul shoots out of the body like a bullet from a gun. So the body must follow. And then, afterwards, your body hurts like hell. So much so that St. Teresa complained that after these ecstasies, she couldn't even pick up her pen. Her quill was too much for her fingers. So here you have St. Anthony of Padua, a medieval Franciscan saint, depicted in the 17th century in ecstasy. He's communing with the Virgin Mary, with the child Jesus. Usually that's traditional iconography for St. Anthony, one of his many ecstasies. But notice he's off the ground. There's a shadow under him. And notice, too, that the angelic choir has the finest, newest 17th century musical instruments. They are up to date. But this whole painting is up to date. Most representations of St. Anthony do not have him off the ground. Next, please. This painting hangs in the Louvre Museum. Art historians don't even know who's being depicted here. But we do know the general thrust of the story. A friar has been assigned to kitchen duty, but he goes into ecstasy. And because he's in ecstasy and cannot obey his superior's orders for kitchen duty, angels come and do his work in the kitchen. But notice he is off the ground. And notice, too, this is a 17th century painting. Almost every image from the 17th century that depicts levitation includes eyewitnesses. The eyewitnesses are part of the tableau. And there you have the eyewitnesses. Next, please. Or, this is not levitation, but this is also impossible, correct? St. Bernard of Clairvaux praying before an image of the Virgin Mary. Suddenly, the Virgin Mary pumps milk out of her breast and feeds St. Bernard. This goes back to the 12th century, this legend. You don't find this in any of Bernard's writings. This is a legend that arose first in Mallorca and then took off. But this is Alonso Cano, 1650, also Spanish. You can be sure Cistercians commissioned this painting, right? They're a great man, Bernard. But what I like about it is that you've got the eyewitness, and it is an image. In some of the other representations of this, it's the Virgin Mary in the flesh, feeding Bernard. But here it's quite clear. the image has come alive. You've got this stream of milk going straight into his mouth. And I always tell my students, if you're ever in Madrid at the Prado Museum and you want to have a really good time, stand next to this painting for a half hour or an hour and listen to the comments people make. Because it's so shocking. Favorite comment I ever heard was a young American student saying to her friend, "This is religion?" And I scared the hell out of her by saying, "Yes, this is religion." Next, please. And the most famous of all, perhaps. This is not a levitation, but maybe it is, because St. Teresa is up on a cloud. She's up on a cloud, and notice her feet are dangling off the cloud. St. Teresa was known for her many levitations, which she hated. And she actually begged God to stop it. And God stopped it. Because Teresa often argued with God and said, "This doesn't serve any purpose. This is embarrassing. This is distracting. Please stop it." He said, "Fine." But the transfiguration, this angel shows up with a dart. It's usually represented here as an arrow or a spear. A dart was more like a short lance. Pierces her heart. Ultimate pain, ultimate ecstasy. And I think there's no Baroque work of art that reifies this Catholic belief in the miraculous and in the possibility of mystical ecstasy, and of mystical ecstasy being accompanied by physical phenomena, right, than this. Everyone, I think, more or less everyone, at one time or another in their life has seen this image at least once. I went crazy this summer, Googling images for the Transfiguration. I found over 100, most from the 17th century. Peak century for depicting this. Next, please. Pardon? No, go back to, if you could, backspace. It's in Rome, Santa Maria della Vittoria. It was a Carmelite convent, and the Cornaro family built their funerary chapel at that church. And actually, the statue is only part of a much larger ensemble that actually in the balconies, the Cornaro family is represented. It's like a theatrical piece. The face of the angel is kind of smirking. Yes, he's having a very good time. Yes, he is. He's smirking. And Teresa is in utter swoon, right? Completely. So, next one, please. Another extreme case. This is not Protestant. This is as un-Protestant as you can get. Sor Maria de Jesús de Agreda. An exact contemporary of Joseph Cupertino, an exact contemporary of Descartes and all the scientists. The lady in blue, Franciscan, who, supposedly, without ever leaving her convent in Agreda, visited the Humano peoples in present-day Texas and New Mexico and converted them to Christianity before the Franciscan missionaries ever got there. Next slide, please. There you go. 500 times, supposedly, she did this. So, 2,640,000 miles, or 4,250,000 kilometers. Never left her house in Agreda because at the age of 15, she and her mother turned their house into a Franciscan convent. So she never actually left her house. But when the Franciscan missionaries get to the Humano people, the natives say, "You don't need to preach to us about Christ or the Virgin Mary. We know all this already. Please baptize us. We're ready. We want to be baptized. We know everything." And is anyone here from the southwest of the United States? Have you ever heard about the lady in blue? Yeah, it's a local legend, right? So, next, please. That's not where it ends. Sor Maria de Agueda also took dictation from the Virgin Mary. Protestants have sola scriptura, Bible alone. Maria gets extra revelation. The Virgin Mary appears to her and dictates her autobiography. She takes it down. 1 million words. The English translation is 4 fat volumes. The Spanish original edition is 6 fat volumes with larger print. But Mística Ciudad de Dios, the mystical city of God, begins with the life of Joachim and Anne. St. Joachim, St. Anne. Goes through the birth of Mary, the childhood of Mary, her adolescence, her marriage to Joseph, birth of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the passion, the resurrection, the ascension. And then guess who is in charge of the infant church? Not Peter. It is the Virgin Mary who is in charge of the church. And more than that, next slide, please. Enter? Yeah. She is co-redemptrix of the human race. And page after page after page, this is proclaimed. Keep in mind, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception had not yet been proclaimed dogma. These Franciscan nuns are all in favor of the Immaculate Conception. And this mystical city of God is, ultimate proof of the Immaculate Conception. But more than that, Mary, depicted here, the traditional iconography for the 7 sorrows of Mary, which has a biblical starting point. Mary's told about the suffering she will have to endure. But in the mystical city of God, Mary reveals that she begged God the Father to allow her to feel all the pain felt by Jesus during his passion and crucifixion. And every pain that Jesus felt, Mary also felt. To the extreme, to the absolute extreme, up to death, which she did not undergo. Next, please. And guess who relied on this book for his film? Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. The passion scenes described in the mystical city of God are truly gruesome. Perhaps even more gruesome than Mel Gibson's film, which I have not yet been able to watch for more than 5 minutes. But in fact, that scourging scene comes straight out of Maria de Agueda. So you want sola scriptura? This is not sola scriptura. This is not scriptural. You want miracles? This is a miracle. What happens to Sor Maria de Agueda? The theological faculty of the University of Paris condemns her book, not because no such revelation could take place, but because it's full of indecencies, including graphic details on how it was that Mary was conceived by Joachim and Anne. Next, please. So, winding up now. What we end up with is a mess. What we end up with is very messy, because Catholics have miracles, and they also have those demonic preternatural tricks. Protestants don't have miracles, but they do have the devil and his preternatural tricks. So Luther, I'm circling back to something I said earlier. Luther says the devil can fool people. Luther's devil was prolific, creative. He called him a Tausendkünstler, thousandfold artist, shapeshifter especially. And one of my favorite Luther stories comes straight out of his table talk. He related this to his students one night after maybe his second or third beer. I came up to my room in the Wartburg one day, he says, and I saw a black dog on my bed that I had never seen before. So he did what any rational person would have done in 1522. He took the dog and threw it out the window. And his room at the Wartburg was about 300 feet off the ground. He ran back downstairs, he tells his students, to find the dog. And of course there was no dog to be found, which was conclusive proof to Luther that the dog had in fact been the devil. If you visit the Wartburg, they show you where he supposedly threw his inkwell at the devil. That was all made up. That's made up. And talk about the miraculous sort of returning. That ink spot on the wall that tourists are shown has been recreated no one knows how many times, because Lutheran pilgrims who wouldn't call themselves pilgrims have come and scratched off the ink, taken a little bit of the ink home. It has to be replastered and repainted. Next, please. And then you also have witches. We can't ever forget about them because they're in league with the devil. And Protestant demonology, being a copy of Catholic demonology, this is why you get this double-barrel persecution. Catholics and Protestants persecute witches with equal ferocity in the 17th century. Next, please. And there you have another example of witch burning. Next. And more witch burning. And finally, on mystical ecstasy. There you get a good close-up of Teresa's expression. Notice her. Her eyes are white. Her eyes are upturned above her eyelids. She's in total ecstasy. Next, please. This is Teresa's description from her autobiography of what happens. What Catholics claim not only can happen, but does happen. And it happened to me. Keep in mind, you may not know this, but Teresa's autobiography was under lock and key with the Inquisition for many years. It wasn't published till after she was dead. And even then, there were a few Dominicans who kept denouncing her to the Inquisition. Even after the autobiography is published, there are Dominicans who come forward and denounce her to the Inquisition. But this becomes Catholic belief, that these ecstasies are in fact divine. They're divine, they're not demonic. That's why I brought the devil up before. Because that's what some people accuse Teresa, including some of her confessors. So all these things you're experiencing are really demonic. To show you how complicated things can get. But now she's very Catholic. With very great and sweet delight, the soul feels it is fainting away almost completely in a kind of swoon. It begins to lose breath and all bodily strength. It cannot even wiggle the hands without great pain. The eyes close involuntarily, or if they remain open, they can hardly see anything. And if it tries to read, it can hardly spell out a single letter or recognize it. It hears but cannot understand what it hears. It can apprehend nothing with the senses. Speaking is impossible, for it cannot bring itself to form a single word. And even if it could, it would not find sufficient strength to pronounce it. For all external strength vanishes, while the strength of the soul increases, so that it may the better enjoy its bliss. This does not happen in Protestantism. It's not supposed to happen. It cannot happen, especially with the Reformed Protestants. Next, please. Now I'm going to show you a few images from one of the world's first graphic hagiographies, published in the 1620s in the Low Countries. It's a graphic hagiography of Teresa, some key scenes. I mean, something that's happening here is she's she marries Christ, a spiritual espousal with Christ. This goes back to the Middle Ages. Catherine of Siena had a similar experience. This is very common. Catholics are now reaffirming this over and against the Protestants. Next, please. There are the eyewitnesses, plenty of eyewitnesses to the levitation. And there's a quote, what I explained to you before. Force pushes you up. Next, please. Teresa constantly says in her autobiography, which is being read by inquisitors, says, oh, you know, I'm sorry, I can't explain this very clearly because I'm only a woman. And I haven't gone to the University of Salamanca. I don't have a theology degree, and I can't explain this or that. Please pardon me if I don't know exactly how to express myself. But by the way, yesterday, I experienced the Trinity. and yes, I was there. I was there, and they were with me, and I was with the Trinity. And yeah, well, there you go. This doesn't happen with Protestantism. This is one of those impossibilities, right? But an impossibility that's made all the more possible because Protestants are saying that it's not possible. Next, please. St. Teresa is also a great demon slayer. Ooh, she knows how to get those demons out. And they're always bothering her. She was convinced, she broke her arm when she fell down the stairs one time. She was convinced the devil had pushed her down the stairs. But she also says in her autobiography, you know, there's a great and easy way to get rid of the devil. They're afraid of the cross, and they're afraid of holy water. And why are they afraid of the holy water? Because it's blessed by the church. And the church has this power against the devil. Talk about a Catholic statement. The holy water is effective because the church makes it effective. It's not effective in itself, it's because it's connected to the church and the power of the church. Next, please. And her ultimate ecstasy was her death, which was interpreted from day one, from the day of her death, was interpreted as a mystical ecstasy so extreme. Her soul shot out of her body so quickly and so violently that she bled to death. Because she did die of a hemorrhage. But it was interpreted not as a death. It was interpreted as the ultimate mystical ecstasy. Best thing that could ever happen. But the last words she was heard to say were, I am a daughter of the Catholic Church. I believe everything the Catholic Church believes. She's reaffirming her Catholicism. And then she says, final words, I am the worst sinner in the world. And then she goes into this ecstasy, and there you go. Good Catholic death. Next, please. And then her body refuses to decompose, as do the bodies of all great saints. Not all great saints, but many. And to this day, they have the relics of Teresa on display. They have the arm in Avila, and they have the heart at Alba, where she died. And one of the strangest stories of the 20th century, during the Spanish Civil War, the Reds, the communists, captured the relic of the hand of Teresa. They didn't know what was inside the reliquary. It was just a silver reliquary, hand-shaped with precious stones on it, so they thought it had monetary value. But then Franco's fascist army captures Granada, and they reclaim the hand. And from that day until the day he died, Francisco Franco never parted company with the hand of St. Teresa. Even made her an honorary general in the fascist army and pinned a medal on the reliquary. Strange, but true. Catholic. Oh, Franco did his utmost, and so did the people around him, to somehow weave together fascism and Catholicism in the strangest possible ways. But that gets us off subject. But you would think that would be impossible. but it's not impossible. It happened. Next, please. And finally, some contrasts. In aesthetics of what you believe about sacred space. It says a lot about your metaphysics. And here we have Mother Church of the Jesuits, the Jesuit Church in Rome, a Baroque splendor at its utmost. Very physical. Very, very physical. Next, please. And then we have St. Bavo Church in Haarlem, in the Netherlands. That's a beautiful church for Calvinists. When all the images were destroyed in Zurich in 1525, very carefully, very orderly, Zwingli steps up to the pulpit of the minster for the first time after it's been cleansed. What he said from the pulpit was, now we finally have a beautiful church in which to preach. And a beautiful church was something like this. Next, please. More of that. Next, please. That's a French Huguenot church that was destroyed during the wars of religion. This church no longer exists. But notice it's round, there are no images, it's simpler, and actually has more people in it than those images of the Calvinist churches. But there's a dog, you see. There's a dog. Not really sacred space. It's not sacred space. You could be doing this in a barn and be happy. Anyway, next please. Closing. Very simple proposition made by Luther and all the other reformers, and also made in reply by the Catholic Church, which is why you get all this splintering, is that there's only one true church. A true church and a false church. And this is Lucas Cranach the Younger's depiction in the 1540s of the difference between a Lutheran church and the Catholic Church. And the Catholics are not only having all of their fake miracles, including, here's a devil with bellows up against the monk's ear, who's preaching without a Bible. But the Catholics are also obsessed with money. There's money everywhere on the side of the false church. But you've got true, you've got false, you've got true to you. So you end up with all these competing churches, each saying that they're the true church. And I once had a math major did a paper for my Reformation class using fractal theory to explain the fragmentation that took place in the 16th century. Beautiful paper. I didn't understand half of it, but I gave her an AA. I thought it was a brilliant approach, that there is might be actually a mathematical formula for the splintering that took place. Next, please. End to end. What do you end up with? Well, you've got a world without miracles. You've got a world full of miracles. You've got two different worlds. You know, but you have more than two different worlds because there's so many Reformations all taking place at the same time, all arguing with each other. This is a mid to late 17th century print that shows you on the left Calvin and Luther arguing and the Pope standing between. The Pope is doing this. And in case you can't see in back, Luther is pulling Calvin's beard. Spiritual squabbling. That's what the German says up on top. Spiritual squabbling. On the right, you have a young shepherdess and her sheep praying directly to God. There's no church. The church is way back here. She's out in the fields. She is the image of the true religion. Whoever produced this flyleaf. That's what you want. The Lord is my shepherd, Psalm 23. Sola Scriptura. But what you do end up with is a kind of exhaustion. Exhaustion of squabbling and fighting, and I didn't even go into the religious wars that were a result of all of this fracture. But to end, this is what I think about the difference between a world full of miracles and a world devoid of miracles. A world devoid of miracles is the secular world, which all of us inhabit now. Did Protestants cause this? No, of course not. The Protestants took an important first step towards, as Max Weber said, ridding the world of magic. But what I prefer to say is that Protestants, what they did was a step towards desacralization of the world. Desacralizing it, which brings it closer to being secular. So that you do end up with this, and this is my final anecdote. You know you've gotten to a point of some kind of exhaustion where people stop caring about what is true. When you have Calvinist iconoclasts in the Netherlands removing the images and selling them to Catholics rather than destroying them. They're objects. They're mere objects. They're not dangerous. They're not demonic. They're just objects. And those Catholics, well, they like their image. They're going to hell anyway, so I'll give them some images. This exhaustion, which sets in gradually, climaxing perhaps in the mid-18th century, is the birth of the secular culture that we all inhabit now. Somewhat aggressive secular culture. When did it get aggressive? That's a whole other story. That's the history of the impossible. Thank you. Thanks for your attention. Oh, yes, definitely. Questions. I love questions. Yes. Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely. And you have some, oh, yes, always with a lot of documentation. Yes. And in some medieval miracles are even more impossible. They were already accepted as perhaps ridiculous in the Catholic Reformation, such as individuals that are cut into pieces and reassembled and come back to life. People who are, again, most of these that I know about involve a death that's by dismemberment, and then the person is brought back to life. I think it's given greater emphasis. It's given greater emphasis, and one of the things I didn't have time to mention, of course, is the invention of the printing press and the lives of the saints and the stories that go with the art, because for a lot of these paintings that I show, there is often an engraver, right, who makes a reproducible image so that people actually see this statue of Teresa in an engraving form. Thousands of people see it. And the emphasis put on this is out of proportion to the emphasis it used to receive in the Middle Ages. So thanks for helping me clarify. Yeah. Yes. Yes. And I think the only way I have found so far to avoid that leap to judgment is to bring huge brackets, right, and bracket the question. Did this really happen, however you define real? What I think a historian can look at is the phenomenon itself and how it's interpreted by the people there who interpret it as real. Right? That's the most, I think, that a historian can do. Because there's no way you can prove whether stigmata are genuine or not as a historian, just by reading documents and texts. We have no film, we have no... And levitation can be faked. Magicians fake it on stage all the time. And the Spanish Inquisition is full of cases that are filed away under the title Inventing the Sacred. These are mostly nuns and lay people who fake all these experiences. And then they're processed and they're found to be fakes. For instance, levitation. I know of one case of a nun who was brought in for faking her levitations. What she was doing is she was standing on a broom under her habit. And people believed that she was levitating, but she was very easily discovered. But there's a famous case of a nun in Lisbon who claimed to have the stigmata and was very carefully, her case was very carefully reviewed. She was proclaimed to be the genuine thing. Then she predicted the defeat of the Great Armada, 1588. And we all know what happened to the Armada. And afterwards she was reinvestigated, and she was proven to be a fake. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes, definitely. And actually, the investigations get more, if you want to use the term, scientific in the more modern sense, right? After the Council of Trent. Oh, definitely. But there's always skepticism. And for anyone who claims mystical experiences and these extraordinary miracles, has a very dangerous edge to them. Because do they need the intercession of the church for anything? Well, what's their authority? Again, back to the question, their authority compared to the parish priest, when in fact, she's seeing the Trinity. So yeah, nobody has done the statistics, because nobody has actually gone through all of the Spanish Inquisition. Archives that survive of these cases, yeah, how many were proven to be, quote unquote, inventing the sacred? We don't know. We don't have a number, but it's a huge number. Yeah. Yes, he was. Yes. Fine distinction, but an important distinction. Matter is not evil. Matter is good. It's just not spirit. It's so inferior. It's so inferior to spirit. That's the distinction they make. Well, it's never bad in the sense that it's evil, because then you're an actual dualist. You believe that, you've got an evil creator who creates evil matter. No, they didn't go that far. They just thought, as Zwingli expressed it, it's an obstacle to the spiritual, because the spiritual is totally disembodied. Well, it is negative in that sense, but I didn't have time to go into the whole Eucharistic debate. But Luther continued to believe in the real presence, and that's the big difference between him and his neighbors to the south. Luther continued to believe in the real presence, and that was the big difference that kept the Lutherans from making a military allegiance with the Swiss, was they would not agree on what the meaning is of "this is my body." And Luther, very interesting, as his debate with the Swiss and the Southern Germans, he's using the Latin, hoc est corpus meum. And when Zwingli brings up the Greek, Luther yells at him and says, no Greek, no Greek. We're not going to discuss the Greek. Est, or ist in German, means is. It doesn't mean signifies. But there, I was reminded when Bill Clinton was impeached, all the semantics about what does this mean, what does that mean, right? That's what was going on at the Marburg Colloquy to some extent. What does is mean? And Luther went as far as to say to the Swiss, because here's what they argued. Very logical. Christ had a human body. A human body can only be in one place at one time. Christ ascended into heaven, so therefore, how can he be in the bread? And Luther says, you guys are being too mathematical. Stop applying mathematics. And then he gets, as he usually gets, starts to get a little angry. And he says, look, if God wants to be in the bread, he can, because he can do whatever he wants. If God had commanded me to eat manure, I would eat manure. He didn't use that polite term. He used another word that he liked very much in German. But meaning, God can do whatever he wants. Yeah. Well, there's one rule that I have borrowed from the inquisitors themselves, which I think helps, which is if this person is very self-effacing, expresses embarrassment to some extent about the attention that they're getting, that's a good sign. That's a very good sign. If somebody's very happy with the fact that King Philip has just visited, and oh, look, I'm being visited by the king. Maria de Agreda, for instance, Philip IV goes out of his way to meet her in person. And then they establish a correspondence that is unique, absolutely unique, over 300 letters. He kind of uses her as a confessor, but of course you can't absolve him. But he pours out his heart to her. Describes all his sins in great detail, blames his sins for the decline of Spain, and she writes back. Maria de Agreda remains in her little convent, Doesn't get much attention. Nobody outside of the royal court, no, I wouldn't say nobody, very few people outside the royal court know about this relationship. She doesn't seek attention, she doesn't get much attention. And I think it's one of the reasons that while theologians at Paris condemned her book, Alcalá, Salamanca, Toulouse, and Louvain universities said, this is okay. This is the real revelation. So, but of course, all of these universities except for Toulouse were under Spanish control. I can't explain Toulouse. Oh, that's a great question. How did Christ navigate the matter-spirit thing, right? Was that? Yeah. Yeah, well, all the exegesis of the miracles, of course, emphasize two things that come to mind immediately. The divinity of Christ, he's special. It's more of a problem with the apostles, because the apostles have this power now, and they're just mere human beings, right? And the other is they go back to this, well, this is special. This is special because there's a message to convey. I should go back and reread, because I've read it twice already. Now I can't remember. There's one passage in the Acts of the Apostles that should have given Calvin pause, and that's where people sit by the side of the road waiting for Peter to pass by so that his shadow will fall on them and they will be healed. That doesn't just involve matter, it involves a shadow. But I should go back, thank you. That's because how he exegetes that is going to be very revealing, I think. Can't remember what it's. Of course, always emphasizing, they had a message, they had a message, they had a message. Yeah, and under Pope John Paul II, they got a boost, because from the late 19th century until the late 20th century, there was a period there where these things were, the church backed away from, to some extent. Although you have, unique things like the miracle at Fatima and so on. But John Paul II gave the okay to several visionaries who had these kinds of experiences. And all these claims of miracles still continue. This is the job I want, but will never have, is the person at the Vatican who gets to investigate the miracles for canonization cases. What a wonderful job. Postulate. But I had a student who was a real wheeler dealer, almost like a confidence man, like a con man. Somehow he got to know the postulator in Rome. He was in Rome for a semester and he got to know him, and he gave him the files for the case of Excellent. Catherine Dexter, yeah. He had the case. And the miracle, yeah. But the miracle that put her over the, back then you needed 3, I think. the miracle that got her, it was the text was all in English, of course, because it was from the United States. But it was a girl who had been born without nerves in her ears. And lo and behold, she developed nerves. And all the doctors could say was, we've never seen this happen before. But I've seen one postulator was interviewed by CBS years ago. And he said, the person we're looking for in these cases, what we really want is an atheist doctor or scientist who is a proclaimed atheist who will say, we have no way of explaining how this happened.